Hello and welcome to episode 196 of Page 1, the Writers' Podcast. I'm Marco.
And I'm Tarek.
And thanks for joining us on the podcast where we like to speak to writers of all kinds about their writing careers, find out how they got into the industry and try and get as many hints and tips as possible. And we have a fantastic back catalogue of authors and more recently lots of agents and editors and people like that finding out what happens once your book has been written. But we are back on to the great authors that we have on the podcast. And this week, we've got a brilliant historical fiction author.
Yeah, we do indeed. This week, we're chatting with the wonderful Conn Iggulden, who has written a real massive a real massive spread, I think was what I was looking for, of historical fiction novels. His latest novel is Nero, which was out just at time of recording back in May 2024, and it's a book written in the kind of the one that always makes me think of is Robert Harris, that kind of Cicero style of taking a real life character and being incredibly accurate to the history of what he's written. Yeah,
and making it almost like a thriller though as well in a way. You're making it an exciting and interestingly, as we discussed in the podcast, although Nero obviously is a historical figure that is, not looked on in the best light perhaps nowadays, he says that through his research he learns to love all of his characters when he's writing these things. So you see the good in all of these figures as you write and research them, like Conn obviously does. And it was also interesting chatting to him about, in his early books with that historical fiction. Obviously, every time we have a historical fiction author on, we're saying, what's more important, authenticity or accuracy? And in his first books, he had, a healer that could heal people by laying their hands on them. So there was almost an element of magic and things in,
kind of fantasy
there,
elements,
which obviously isn't historically accurate, but it worked for that story. And I think it shows that different stories require different rules, I guess, in terms of the type of story you want to tell, and they can all work. But it's a really interesting chat. Conn is a lot of fun to speak with, and he tells us that he feels he's at the height of his powers at the moment in terms of the work that he's producing. He is incredibly prolific, and he's already...
It's not just historical fiction he's written, of course. He's done,
no, exactly.
As he says, a couple of kids' books he's written with his brother, The Dangerous Book for Boys,
which was a massive
hit. Yeah.
So he clearly enjoying his writing at the moment, I think it's fair to say. So we'll get straight into it after a quick advert for our Writer's Notebook, and then we'll be back at the end of the podcast with a bit more chat and to let you know about next week's guest.
But for now, on with the podcast.
The blank page. To some, it's terrifying, an obstacle to overcome. But we prefer to think of it as an opportunity, a blank canvas to be filled with all of the adventures and characters in our head. So how to overcome that fear? Well, we all know the best advice for a writer is write. Seriously, get words on the page and more will follow.
But what about later, when you start trying to pull those threads of what you've written together? What about the character you wrote about way back at the start? Who was she again? What was she carrying? And where did she leave the MacGuffin that she now really needs in the third act? Think about all those top thrillers you like to read, or that amazing drama you just watched. What did they all have in common? Structure and planning.
As aspiring writers ourselves, we've tried many different methods to try and organise all the thoughts about the stories we want to tell. We've been there searching for a piece of scrap paper to note something down, or making a quick note on our phone in between meetings.
Or sometimes we'll make a note in whatever notebook we're carrying, or a document on our laptop so we don't forget that great idea. Let's be honest, it can all be a bit messy and it's easy to lose track of everything. And that's when we realise it's not just the story that needs structure and planning, but the way we gather all of our thoughts about it as well.
And so we made Page 1. Page 1 is more than just another notebook. It's a place to put down all your ideas for your latest project, divided into easy-to-use sections that will help you plan your story, so that when that blank page comes calling, you're ready to answer. And then afterwards, once it's written, we realised you need to plan how to let people read it, so we included a section relating to submissions.
Each one is designed for one project, Whether you want to write a book, screenplay, a comic, or any other kind of story, we truly believe that when you use it, it will help you get to the main event, writing your story. So we hope this helps.
We can't wait to read what you come up with.
And remember, every story starts with page 1.
So my common starter question on these podcasts is, did you always want to be a writer? And I'm going to guess with yourself, the answer is yes, because I think you were sending books off to publishers from a very young age. Is that right?
Yes, I always, almost my earliest memory, I think I probably spent a few years between maybe 5 and 10 where I wanted to be a vet. But that was because I found a dead crow and tried to dissect it with a bread knife. And it was a moving and enjoyable experience. Oh dear, I didn't expect to get quite so deep psychologically quite so early as this, but yeah. Apart from that cul-de-sac of ambition, when I discovered, what science A-levels you really need to be a vet, much more so than for a human doctor. They only have one type of patient at the end of the day, and let's deal with multiples. Yes, I started telling stories, I suppose, to my brother. From a very, very young age. I mean, almost from infancy. That was one of the things we used to do. He did it as well. We used to have characters that we would follow and develop and establish different points in their lives. And then we got, like Adrian Tchaikovsky, I did hear the episode with him. I got into Dungeons and Dragons as well. And, we went through with my brother and my brother's friends, we went through all sorts of adventures together. And I was often the dungeon master, the one making up the stories and setting the rules and introducing sort of characters and things like that. And it's not bad preparation for storytelling. And that's for some reason what I always wanted to do, right from the very earliest memories, yeah.
And I think I've read that you were sending books off constantly to publishers as you grew older, and kind of across all genres. So, what sort of stuff were you writing? Was it just whatever you get was in your idea popped into your head at that point, just write a story about it?
Yes, I mean, I'm embarrassed looking back on it how little I understood genres, because science fiction I always loved, fantasy I always loved. I always read historical fiction without really recognizing that it was a genre. So I was reading George MacDonald Fraser and Patrick O'Brien and Bernard Cornwell and C.S. Forrester, the Hornblower books, people like that. James Clavell's Taipan, Shogun, all of these books, without really saying to myself, this is a genre of adventure filled in and thriller, but filled in with a historical skeleton. It never occurred to me that that's what I was reading. I just knew that I enjoyed it. And I was sort of aware that, every book I read had more than one strand to it. There was an exciting story, great. You cared about what was happening next and cliffhangers and so on, but you'd also learn things. In Dick Francis, I used to read his thrillers and discover that a horse cannot vomit. And little facts like that would stick in my mind. And that was true of thrillers, and it was even more true of historical fiction, which I had read and learned about Victorian England from Flashman and, Bernard Cornwell's Sharp. I'd learned about, the Napoleonic Wars and from Patrick O'Brien and Bernard Cornwell. I mean, these were my history teachers, I suppose, from quite a young age. But right from the very beginning when I was writing and sending off books to publishers, it was without that understanding that historical fiction would be my genre. I wrote books. I wrote a Western. I wrote a book about somebody with who could kill with the power of their mind. I mean, some of it is a bit... I look back and I think, good God, Conn. I wrote one about... I was quite pleased with one. I called it Silver Kisser. And it was about people who could bond in some way with metals, different metals, establishing a fantasy world of different types where the silver kissers were the elite in this sort of way. And one hadn't been seen for centuries. Sent that off, sent them all off. I mean, that was one thing I did. I was never too shy about sending them off to publishers. I would, if I had access to a photocopier, as I did in my early days of work, I would photocopy it, usually using someone else's number, and send it off. And then 20 times later, it would come back onto my doorstep and my doormat. I used to put a hair from my head in between the pages when I was convinced that no one was reading it. And very often the hair would be in exactly the same place. And I mentioned that you begin to be suspicious after a while. You think, well, no one could have read it that quickly. I mentioned it to an editor in Penguin years and years ago, and he said, oh, yes, lots of people do that. We always try and make sure the hair goes back in the same place. which is horrible and cynical, but almost certain. I don't know if he was having fun with me or not, but it's a brutal sort of activity. You write a book, it takes you a year, you send it off to 20 different people or 30 different people, and go into in those days to the Writers and Artists Handbook and finding anyone who is even vaguely connected with the sort of area, and then sending it all off and then waiting slowly to get it all back. And it did become dispiriting. I was interested in the Adrian Tchaikovsky bit where he said it became sort of exhausting. I felt dispirited towards the end of that process, and I began thinking, I can't invest a year in writing and then send it off only to get everything back in 6 weeks or 2 months. So what I'll do is I'll just do beginnings. I'm not bad at beginnings, and I'll just send those off. It's a lot easier to write beginnings, and then I haven't invested so much if they get turned down. So I started doing that. I wrote just about 3 chapters, and I sent those off, and it was like a scattergun sort of thing. And then eventually I got a letter I was still sending to publishers in those days. I didn't really understand about agents, but I was still sending to publishers, and one of them wrote back to say, "We've read, your first 3 chapters. We'd like to see the rest." And I honestly couldn't remember which beginning. I had written so many. At that point, I had no idea which one they were on about. I think I literally had to hope for the best, but I finished the book in a great frenzy. It took me a very short period of time, like it can't have been 72 hours, it's impossible. But let's say 3 weeks. I finished the book and I sent it off to them, and it was the most exciting sort of period of my life. And then they rejected it, which was an extraordinary blow, a real punch in the kidneys, and it really surprised me. That happened, as I remember it, that happened 3 times. 3 times I had a beginning accepted, wrote the book, and then they rejected the thing, which for me was fairly brutal. And when the story with Julius Caesar came about, I was teaching, I'd got myself promoted, I was sort of working my way up. I wasn't head of department then, but I was seeing a career path ahead of me. And I came across the story of Julius Caesar when I was sitting covering someone else's lesson, a history class, and I'd forgotten to bring anything with me. I often did that. So I had to. It's very dull when a class is working silently, and it's torture to relatively sensitive human being. You've got to sit there and do nothing. So I would often read the books around me. I picked up all sorts of information in different subjects over the years. And this one, I just opened a book, and it was about Augustus Caesar, Octavian, throwing the heads of Julius Caesar's assassins at the foot of his statue in Rome, and there were 23 assassins. And so I thought, well, there were 23 heads, and the head is the single largest, heaviest item in the human body. You can't carry 23. I mean, you'd have to carry sort of 6s or 7s, and even with a sort of pyramid effect, I was thinking, how on earth is this going to work? So I started looking into it, and from that point, I realised that there was a story there, and everything changed. I didn't try and just write a beginning. I wrote the whole thing, and actually, it took me 2 years. Because I was working full time and I was polishing away. It was 93,000 words. To go back to those pre-internet days, that was a time when I would pick up a David Gemmell book, count the words on a page, multiply those words by the number of pages, and get a sense of what a book should be. Because there was no internet. You couldn't look
that's
up.
a good point, actually. I hadn't even thought of that before, but how did you... It's such an easy thing to check now, but before the internet would be a nightmare.
No, I don't think, honestly, my kids, they have no idea. No, they don't know they're born. They don't know how lucky they are.
Back
but
in my day,
in terms of access to easy admin information like that, my goodness, I was completely sort of working blind. In terms of things like not knowing what historical fiction was as a genre, when I wrote my first Julius Caesar books, I knew right from the beginning that I'd have to work with the problem of the Ides of March. Mm-hmm. How is it that all through Caesar's life, not just at the very end when anyone can make a prediction, but right through his life, people apparently kept coming up to him and saying, by the way, beware the Ides of March, the 15th of March. Be careful of that time, very dangerous for you personally. And either that's added in later in the history books, which is quite possible, or there was someone around him who had the ability to tell the future. And I had to make that decision. And I went with the ability to tell the future, which I look back on and I think, I don't know if that was the right decision. It was a fun character to have. Once I had him, I used him in other ways. I had him healing someone with his hands, and so therefore it was beginning to stray out of my genre of historical. And that, that's funnily enough, over the years, people have criticised me. I put Julius Caesar and Brutus very close together in age, and some people are still convinced that they were father and son, which isn't possible, but they nonetheless believe that. At one point, Brutus was engaged to Julius Caesar's daughter, and you don't do that with your own son. Even in Rome, where things were perhaps a bit looser, that's a step too far. But for those who were unhappy at some of my choices made, I would say, in the blissful ignorance of those pre-internet days, no one ever criticised me for having someone who could heal with their hands. Not once. I've had people email me about the fact that I used the word corn where I clearly meant wheat. And there's no point explaining to Americans that in England, when you say corn, you sometimes mean wheat. It's not a word like that maize thing that you all know apparently grows in South America. They're all experts on corn and maize in America. And they would email me about, I don't know, shield shapes. That's a huge debate. Whether the shields were lozenges or ovals or squares or whatever, and when they changed over, and various details of the Roman legion life. And no one ever sort of said, but Conn, you included magic, which is very strange. But it goes back to the fact that I was feeling my way into a genre that I hardly knew I even loved. Although right from the beginning, looking back on it, it was my genre. That, and I suppose fantasy, because I did always love fantasy as well. But there's a huge overlap between those two genres. And again, I didn't really know that at the time. I just knew what I liked to read.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask about the sort of historical fiction and this idea of accuracy and things like that. And you'll get the emails and things like that. And we've spoken to some other historical fiction writers, and often what comes up is a question of authenticity versus accuracy. So you want it to feel, it's important that it feels like that period, even if some authors anyway take this approach that they want it to feel like that. But if every single detail isn't absolutely correct, as long as the story works, then they're happy. But other authors are much more, no, everything has to be accurate. This has to have happened on this particular day, etc., etc. Where do you fall in that bandwidth?
Yeah, I have fallen over the years at different points on the sort of spectrum, because as I say, in my early days I took a slightly looser approach to it, but over the years I will say somewhat bruised and battered by the responses that I've had from people. I've realized how desperately important it is. So when it comes to something like Nero, it's not that you make no choices in the fictional aspect, because you must. There are parts of Julius Caesar's life, parts of Nero's life that simply aren't known. If it's something like the death of Tiberius, was he smothered? Was Caligula present when he was smothered? Was Nero's mother present? Was Nero present? Who was physically in the room? When it comes to things like that, there are very few clues, because you don't tend to record the death of an emperor. And those who are foolish enough, like Julius Caesar's assassins, they walked through Rome with red hands held up, bloody hands, and they had coins printed with the word liberatores, saying, we are liberators from tyranny, and a little picture of a Roman dagger. And every single one of those 23, none of them died a natural death. So the lesson there is that you do not trumpet your guilt when it comes to the death of emperors, which means that there will always be gaps in the record where no one has ever admitted to being part of it. Tiberius makes a decision. Tiberius is dead. Claudius decides to stop making Nero his heir. So the adopted son, Nero, is now not going to be his future emperor and heir. Mysteriously, Claudius instantly dies. And you know who was responsible for it. It had to be Nero's mother. She was the only one who could get close to him. Other people around her had died of poisoning. She was a ruthless, spiky, broken woman who was quite capable of carrying out a murder, but the actual proof is missing. So as a historical fiction writer, I understand you will have to fill some gaps. What I've understood over 20 years is that people want those gaps to be as small as possible, to be consistent, to fit the story and the character, and that it's really important to get it right. I've learned this partly by reading great examples of historical fiction like Wilbur Smith, for example. His stuff, his early stuff is beautifully described and realized, but he had a fictional character at the beginning with the Courtney family. I've sort of seen different ways of doing it, but that's what I've settled on. If you're going to pick a real character like Nero, it has to be as accurate as humanly possible, because there will be some moments that no one can tell. For example, Julius Caesar, when he died, it's reported, I think in Suetonius, that when he saw Brutus walking across the floor of Pompey's theatre, and he was in the middle of being attacked, he must have thought that he was being saved because he'd known Brutus for decades. But when he saw Brutus held a knife, he picked up the hood of his toga, the hem of his toga, and he pulled it over his head. And then he sat there and continued to sit while they continued to stab at him until he was dead. So we don't know why he did that. There is no way to know whether it was... I've heard it suggest that he was afraid, but that doesn't fit his character at all. He was a man of great physical courage. He never lost a battle, and he was present for all of them. And it might have been contempt. I can imagine there's no body of work that studies... funnily enough, there is a body of work that suggests why murderers cover the face of their victim, and the police always look for people who might have felt shame, people who knew the victim. But there's no body of work for victims who cover their own face. It doesn't exist. It's unique, as far as I know, in history. So when you get something like that, I can't just leave it and suggest and say nothing. I have to go with Caesar in the last moments of his thoughts and convey those to the reader. And that's my job. It's something that's important to get right, and I expect the reader to sort of trust, I hope the reader trusts me to do it in a consistent way, in a way that works with the character and the plot.
I think I read somewhere you talked about the story of Spartacus and how, the real story compared to the Kubrick film version, and how, I think in real life he was pretty much he had the opportunity to pretty much escape.
Yes, completely.
But he turned round and went for Rome, and that was what had him. That was why he was caught, etc. Whereas in the film, that's not really the case. They don't show making that kind of error, that kind of foolish error. So I suppose that's quite a big change in someone's character, and leading up to his death. And obviously Kubrick's made that choice because he wants the viewer to see Spartacus as this hero, not as a kind of fool.
Perfect example. My God, I couldn't have come up with a better one, because it doesn't change the events at all. The events are exactly as they are, but what has been done there is, as you say, it's changed the viewer's perception of the character, because it minimizes it removes a cock up. And that's where historical fiction is in its element, I think, in its grey area. It is where the writer gets a chance to portray a character that he or she loves in a positive or negative way. But it is, and I say loves because I always end up loving my characters. It's an unavoidable, even Genghis Khan, even bless him, old Genghis. There is affection in the writer because you are living, not with just what someone did, good or bad, not just with what other people said about them, but also what is going on in their own heads. And to understand all is to justify and accept all. When you are dealing with someone's personal thoughts, you begin to sort of see their own justification. And almost no one says of themselves that they are evil. Even someone like Genghis Khan, who might destroy a city, did it for very good, by his lights, very good reasons. So when you're working hard to get into his thoughts, you cannot help but accept his own justifications for doing it. His justification, by the way, for destroying a city was that the next city would open its gates. If he says, open your gates, and they do, then he would leave the city almost, without any trouble at all. But if they refused and forced him to stay there, he had no siege weapons. He was always miserable about having to... His first attempt to get into a Chinese city, someone came up with the brilliant idea of bypassing a river to flood out the city, and he managed to flood his own army off the field. Little details like that when Genghis was attempting to find out how to take walled cities used to amuse me back in the day when I was writing about that. But this is, for me, the absolute heart of historical fiction. You get into the person's head. You try and understand them, and in understanding them, you come to love them. And that is a strong word, but I think it's justified. I lived 6 years with Julius Caesar, and by the end, I could hardly write his death. I think I stopped writing and did nothing for 2 weeks before I was able to write the assassination, because it was like, obviously, it was like writing the death of a friend. It was something I had known, I would say intimately, as ridiculous as that sounds. I'd known him intimately for 6 years and didn't want his story to come to an end in that horrible way when he, was broken by the process, by seeing his friend. I mean, he didn't just fall off a horse, he was betrayed and murdered, and that was a horrible thing to write. It was difficult for me.
And in all of that, I wanted to ask a bit about your writing process then, because obviously to know your characters as well as you do, there must be a lot of time that you're spending researching in all of this. Is that something that you're doing? Are you front loading that research before you start writing, or is it an ongoing process?
It's both. I do front load it. I do an awful lot of research before I can put pen to paper, because I know how important it's going to be to understand the person. So with someone like Nero, for example, the first thing I was trying to do was to find who he was as a person. I knew his mother was going to play a crucial part, because to understand Nero, you have to know his mother. Sister to Caligula, wife to Claudius, mother to Nero. She was a key player in that era. But to understand, Nero was emperor from 16 to 30. So, how did he was raised up too early. He was given all the power in the world. Yes, of course, it corrupted him. No, he wasn't a saint. But how on earth did he manage to lose everything in just 14 years? That took some doing. And so to understand how that happened, you had to realize that he wasn't a man interested in ruling at all. He wasn't interested in conquest. All he wanted was to play music, write poetry, perform in public. He loved acting. Chariot racing, which he was good at. He won in the Olympics at a 10-horse chariot race, which was the sort of Formula One of the day, with chariots skidding all over the place. He wanted a life of art, when art was seen as unmanly and un-Roman. Even the chariot racing, which I would have thought was pretty manly by today's standards, was seen as a low-class occupation. He could admire it, he could bet on it, he could have teams named after him, but he couldn't actually ride on the chariots. That was seen as a low-class, working-class sort of activity. And as a result, his mentors were horrified at almost everything he wanted to do. And the big break at the end of his life, the reason he lost the support of the Senate and everyone else, is not because he did something awful. It's because he left Rome and went to Greece, and for years went from festival to festival to festival, one of which was the Olympics, and performed and played music. And the great lyre master of the day, Terpnus, came to lay his lyre at Nero's feet after a performance. Now, you could argue that Terpnus was no fool, and it is true that after that sort of accolade, Nero allowed Greece to have no taxes imposed on them by Rome anymore. So maybe they all knew which side their bread was buttered, and how to flatter a man who was clearly desperately in need of being flattered. But he is a character who is tragic, in the sense that he didn't even want to be emperor, but he wasn't the sort of man who could be a good emperor. Mm-hmm. So for me, the story of Nero the character is crucial. It's absolutely vital that I understand his rise and fall. And again, I'm not suggesting he was a saint, but he was just never suited for the job. And that isn't the way Nero is taught, is represented, is understood by people. They say Nero, yes, the tyrant, burned Rome, and the great fire of Rome, fiddled while Rome burned, cared nothing for the people. But those people welcomed 3 false Neros after he was dead, who came into Rome and said, I am Nero, like Elvis is, or Russian princesses reborn. And they cheered him then. And those people loved him. And that was part of the story that hasn't been told. In fact, has been deliberately undermined by people like Suetonius, concentrating on sexual shenanigans and the worst possible spin on the events of his life. I mean, for example, I don't want to go too much into Nero, no one but Nero, but yes, his wife, Poppaea, died and she was pregnant, and it was at a time in his life when he was desperate for an heir. So in the historian Tacitus suggests that Nero kicked her by accident or that she died in childbirth. Now, there's an example of a blank spot in history. So in other words, Tacitus, who was closer to Nero than Suetonius decades later, Tacitus didn't know for certain how that woman died. And women died, like Caligula's first wife, died in childbirth all the time. However, did Nero, the way Suetonius said it was that Nero, in a vengeful mood, kicked Poppaea to death, his pregnant wife. And it's one of the great horrors of ancient Rome. But you can see that it has been spun. It has been spun by people who didn't want Nero to be remembered fondly. And then you've got to ask yourself the question, well, why is that? What did it matter to them that decades before? And the answer, I think, is simple and, in its way, interesting, chilling. Richard III had a similar process by which the Tudors rewrote his image after his death when he was no longer around to argue. Because the worse they could make Richard III look, the better they looked in comparison. Look who we saved you from. Nero is the same. When Suetonius is writing, it's for Hadrian later on, and Hadrian had no particular right to rule. Nero's line starts with Julius Caesar and ends with Nero. Everyone after him is no longer part of the bloodline and the family line, sometimes including adopted children, but Rome was pretty mild about that sort of thing. So that line finishes with Nero, and then the people after that have no justification for why they were allowed to rule. So the worse they can make Nero look, and rolling him in with Caligula and Tiberius as if they were roughly the same person, the better they look in comparison. Look who we saved you from. And that's what I've been trying to do with this trilogy. I've been trying to find the man, if you like, beneath the spin. And I think it's been marvelous for me because I've absolutely loved doing it. I think, Nero and I think would have got on. I think we apart from the chariot racing, which I've never seen, but I would have loved, I think as long as I, didn't cross him, because my God, he had a temper. But I think we'd have gone on. I think I would have enjoyed it. But maybe that's just the affection speaking. Again, the writer's affection.
But it's interesting listening to you talk about it, and obviously your passion and the research you put in comes through entirely there. But going back to that earlier point about the sort of accuracy of things, obviously, especially when you're taking historical figures from so long ago, there must be a lot that is open to your interpretation as the author, yes, because there are these different sources, and there are, you can read it, like, as you said, you can read into it, why is this person saying a different story? Well, I think it's because of this. But ultimately, all of that is your take on it and for your story, presumably. So there are certain things that have happened that obviously have to be included and stuff. But as the author, obviously, it's your story and you're telling your story. Is that fair to say?
I mean, there are first of all gaps. It is a matter of sadness for me that Agrippina, Nero's mother's autobiography, has not survived to the modern day. It is particularly upsetting that the final chapters of Tacitus's Annals of Ancient Rome, the bit on Nero's death, have vanished, and we don't have those either. So for his death, the only source is Suetonius, and that means that you have to sort of look at it, but take into account the bias that you've read all the way through when there was Tacitus to compare it to. And Tacitus wrote, as I say, about Poppaea's death, that it might have been in childbirth, but Suetonius was certain, Nero kicked his wife to death. And it's with that sort of thing that you take the personal bias into account, or try to. However, there are always choices. I remember with Julius Caesar, I was reading Plutarch, and it said about Brutus that some believed he was of noble stock, a noble line, descended from, I think, ancient kings. But others, particularly those who celebrated and supported Julius Caesar, said that he was of common stock and a different line entirely. And I remember thinking at the time, well, that's fine for Plutarch, isn't it? But I can't have both. I have to make a choice and then stick with it. And then eventually someone will email me to say, well, you picked low caste, you picked common because you thought it would be more interesting, but actually he was a nobleman of this line or this line. And it's tricky, because it is 2,000 years ago, and as I hope I've demonstrated, there are huge gaps in it. I mean, when I was writing about Pericles, the name of his sister hadn't survived. So she was there, she got married, but no one had actually bothered to put her name in the historical record. So I had to make it up. And little things like that, you realize that you are dealing not only with a history that has gaps, but also the interpretation of historians before. And that is important. Sometimes I feel that when it's 2,000 years old and you only have a couple of sources, some people take that as holy writ in a way that we never would with a modern historian, where we understand completely that if this historian is writing about a contentious figure, then they might be bringing their own personal bias to it. But somehow, if it's 2,000 years old, it's all the only source we've got. We say, yes, Tiberius lived from this time to this time, and he spent these years on Capri, and the damage he did was incalculable. And the only source for that would be Suetonius, but we have to take his word for it because there is no other. And that's a problem to some extent. But my answer to it has always been to read as widely as possible and to find as many original sources as possible, and then to try and find the consistency in it. Plus, you're perfectly right, my own judgment that when I see how long Nero spent in performance, for example, then I say to myself, well, clearly music, poetry, acting in masks, in the Greek style, was important to him. And I guess that's a personal conclusion derived from, the time he spent away from Greece. I think I'm right, and I think it's an important part of his personality, but there will always be an element of interpretation, without a doubt.
Mm-hmm.
So when you have decided the character that you want to focus on and you're kind of excited, you've done your research, etc., when you come to sit down to actually write the book, what's your process there? How are you kind of a 9-to-5 author? Do you have a set time? Do you have a word limit that you try and hit? What's your process?
I do have a word limit. For years, I picked an arbitrary figure of 1,000 words a day, and I thought that was reasonable. And then about 2 years ago, I think it might have been something to do with the pandemic, or I thought, I wonder, what happens if I just move it to 2,000 words a day and just stay and keep going, even if I get tired. And to be perfectly honest, at one point I used to say to my wife, I think I've sprung a lobe because my head was hurting so much. But that turned out to be a shoulder blade problem that was leading to headaches rather than what I was considering it was, which was actually I was working so hard, my brain was being damaged. But 2,000 words a day was something I could do, and that's an awful lot. If you can, and then I was doing Monday to Friday, 2,000 words a day, taking the weekends off, and that was working. But that meant that I was producing at a great rate. And I have written the entire Nero trilogy. All 3 books are finished, and with the publishers, they've been edited. They haven't got covers for the second 2, but they've agreed that they can put 2 of them out next year instead of just 1 a year, because they've never had 3 books in the can before. And that was partly because I fell in love with the story, but partly because I'm still finding my sort of limits. There is an old story about the artist who painted a painting, and the patron didn't want to pay for it, so it went to court, and the judge said, some old judge, fossil, he said, so how long did it take you to paint this? And he said, about 4 hours. He said, how long were you, how much were you going to charge for that? And he said, I thought about £1,000. He said, oh, goodness me, that's rather a lot for 4 hours work, is it not? And he said, well, yes, but you have to realize it's not the 4 hours it took me to paint it, it's the 20 years it took me to be good enough to paint it. And that's my point, I suppose. At the moment, I'm slightly worried that I'm in a purple patch, and purple patches, like your youth, will eventually come to an end and disappear. But I am in a bit of a purple patch and in love with writing, and I feel like, this sounds immodest, but I feel like I'm at the height of my powers. I've had decades to learn my genre, to become good at writing, and Nero is the best I've ever done, and it was the material. The material was what brought that about. So I've been writing, yes, as many hours as I could do. If I wasn't actually writing, I was researching it or going to Rome and pacing out bits of the Palatine and things like this, because I thought it was worth it. I thought the material was good enough. But as for the other process, it seems to me that the big thing in writing is not necessarily the lines, it's choosing the scene. What comes next? And so when I start with Nero, for example, I thought, well, he was born in AD 37. I know his mother's absolutely vital to the story, so I want to have an opening scene with her brutal husband, Gnaeus Ahenobarbus, a man who was he blinded one man like Fury, like the boxer Fury's father, who gouged a man's eye out and went to prison for 4 years. Gnaeus Ahenobarbus got away with it. He also rode another man down on the Via Appia with his chariot. He was a man of, apparently for fun, he was a man of great violence. He married when he was 30 years old. He married Agrippina aged 13 and was horrible to her. And she only had the one child about 7 years later. And this was the moment, AD 37, when she's pregnant and the husband is being summoned into Rome because he's had an affair with a senator's wife and is in terrible trouble. If he runs, then they lose everything. But if he goes in, he could be executed. And I thought, this is the moment I need. And yes, I made it that there was a storm coming. And yes, you could argue that the imagery is a bit simplistic. I can't apologize for that. I had them standing in the courtyard arguing about whether he should go into Rome or not, with the clouds bursting overhead. And yes, I suppose it also matters that I had a house just outside Rome for years, and I've gone to the Amalfi Coast since I was 17, so I've seen a few Roman thunderclaps in my time, and I've got a sense of how these great storms strike and crash, unlike the drizzle of the weather at home. And you put the scene together, not just the 20 years of experience of writing, and not just the research, but the choice of scene. And then that's the bit, that's the opening. And from there, everything else comes. Everything else is sort of character and plot, but you still have to choose which window to open next, which scene comes next.
When you're writing 2,000 words a day, that, as you say, that is a lot to hit.
Yes.
And a lot of people listening to this will think, God, I can barely hit 500 words, and I meant 2,000. But I suppose, is it different when you're writing a historical fiction, because in terms of the planning and the plotting of the story, it's kind of already done for you? Like, as you say, it's about choosing how you tell the story as opposed to coming up with the story and knowing where you go with the tale.
The reason I mentioned scene selection is I think it's incredibly important. You do have the skeleton of the history, but it's like those Adrian Tchaikovsky books. He mentioned about, worlds of insects, but there's a story in there that you have to care about the characters in the meantime. So I started, I think, book 2 on Agrippina's wedding day, and I had an entirely different, completely accurate historical scene of a man who was effectively told to commit suicide, that he'd been accused of incest, and therefore he was done. And it didn't matter that it had happened or not happened. It hadn't. He was innocent. But and I wanted to highlight that because it showed her character, the utter ruthlessness of Nero's mother, and it showed her getting rid of one of her possible dangers, future dangers. She was clearing the decks as she got married. It was actually a little bit like, the Mafia Godfather films. The enemies all get cleared away at crucial moments. These are, I hope, key scenes of story that have to be included. And if I have any ability at all, it's picking those scenes and choosing which ones come next and which characters I need to develop, because the history, the skeleton is laid out. Which is both a blessing and a curse to a degree. I've always thought my stories worked best if I knew, it sounds silly, if I knew too much and I had too much to fit in, and I was always struggling, like juggling too many balls. How on earth am I going to get to this bit? And if I do that, then I believe it makes it faster paced, because I'm struggling to stuff everything in. If I ever got to a position where I had not enough information and I was trying to pad it out, I think it would slow down. And I prefer fast moving. I want a thriller. I want cliffhangers, just exactly like a Dan Brown end of chapter. That is my intention. It is. I am pleased by no other compliment pleases me as much as someone saying I stayed up till 2 o'clock in the morning. I couldn't put it down. Yeah. And that's not because I want to educate. I want to thrill. The knowledge of Rome and the story of Nero is secondary to that. The story always has to come first. It has to be exciting, or it doesn't work.
And when you're, obviously this trilogy of books, and we should say Nero is out, I think, next week. May the 23rd. At the time of recording. But when you're picking a new story to tell, so a new series or whatever, how do you pick the character? How do you pick the time period? Is it just that you're always reading, you're always researching, you're thinking this could be something worth exploring?
It can come from different places. The Nero thing came because I went to a British Museum exhibition and I saw suddenly while walking around that the man I thought of as a tyrant and a monster was loved. And that was the surprising contrast that made me think, hang on. You know, I should know by now that there isn't ever one narrative. There isn't ever one view of a character. I mean, even Julius Caesar understood that back in the day when he went bald as an egg, but all his statues had hair. I mean, there is a sense of, you know, how history is written, sometimes even by the people who are in it. I've forgotten who it was who said to Claudius not to go back and rewrite part of the Roman history, that there were too many hands on it already. You realize after a while that wherever you look in history, that there is a story. It's almost guaranteed. I mean, I'm not this. I hope this doesn't sound like boasting because it isn't meant to be. But if you picked a date, and it could be, let's pick something, you know, tricky, 1515. It was tricky because I don't know anything about the period. But if you went back and started researching, it is, after all, the story of all humanity up to that point. They have their own great figures, their own loved, their traditions, their faith. Everything that was important to them is written down, and everything that wasn't important has probably been forgotten. So you're looking at the best stories of humanity, and as soon as you look for them, there will be stories there. It could be a sort of touching the void disaster, Simpson, or it could be a conquering of a particular nation, or a man who lived to 112. But it'll be something, because that's what history is. It's the stories of humanity written down, mostly, and an awful lot of them have been lost. So there will be gaps in it. But every time I look for a story, the story is there. The only difficulty sometimes is picking a century that I want to research. I don't think the 16th century will be it particularly. Maybe. I mean, I'll never say never to any of these things, but it's never been my experience that it's hard to find a story, because whenever I look, it's there. I mean, that's true. When I looked at Genghis, there was so little written about Genghis. There's literally only one book called The Secret History of the Mongols, and it was commissioned during Genghis's lifetime. No one knows the author, and there is no other source. So you have to sort of start with that. And after that, I had to go to Mongolia to see the landscape and the people and the tiny ponies. And you pick up 1,000 small things that you didn't know just from seeing the place. I'm not sure that would be true if you went to New York today. You wouldn't be able to write too much about the original island of Manhattan. But in Mongolia, there's an awful lot of it that still looks like the Mongolia, the sea of grass that Genghis knew. So that's the other thing I do. Once I've found a story, I have to go to the locations. For me, it's the only real way to get a sense of what it, of how it should look on the page.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you've also written a number of fantasy novels. The Darien trilogy, Emperor of Salt is the first one, and you said at the start how much you kind of enjoy fantasy as well, and you see a kind of crossover between fantasy and historical, and I can see that. And I also wanted to ask you not just about your fantasy books, but also the fact you use a pen name for your fantasy novels. But not your children novels, which you've also done. But how do you decide when you use a pen name and when you don't, and the marketing of all that stuff?
I mean, I've always used my ordinary name, Conn Iggulden, and it's only because I did I think I put C.F. Iggulden on the fantasy novel.
It's close. It's a very small change, isn't it?
Yes, it's not a code that is particularly difficult to crack, I say. So I think it was me thinking of Ian M. Banks and Ian Banks. I think I was thinking along those lines to make a difference, because I know that some people will not touch fantasy. I mean, they have the most dismissive of attitudes towards it as a genre, and so I wanted those people to at least know that this was me trying fantasy and not my main line, if you like. And it was, in many ways, it was harder for me because for the first time in my life, I had for the first time since being published, I had the sort of horror of the blank page. I had to come up with all of the plot myself. And that was tricky. I had to write without being able to go back to research. It was a freedom of sorts. It meant I could go absolutely anywhere, but it was a dangerous sort of freedom. I didn't want to go absolutely anywhere. I wanted to have a skeleton plot laid out. So it was something I enjoyed doing. I believe, the book's sold all right, but the publishers are not knocking my door down saying, please do more of those. So who can tell? I mean, I've had a very mixed publishing career. I've always had ideas. I've always been an ideas guy. So I mean, you wouldn't know this, but I frequently get turned down by the publishers, even quite recently, because I send them an idea. I write a sort of summary and a few chapters, and they say, the last time, actually, it was a sort of financial advice book. And they said, the problem with this, Con, is that you know nothing. You know nothing about financial advice. They said, for this to work, you would have to have some sort of qualification in the financial services or a degree in economics, something like that. Con, you have none of these things. So your desire to explain to people about the financial world will not sell, which is very disappointing. But they frequently turn me down with this sort of thing, and I don't sweat about it too much. I never did. When I used to get turned down by all those publishers, I would wrap the book up in brown paper and string and stick it in the attic and then start again and hope that bit by bit I would get better. And then every now and then, the dangerous book was the ridiculous one that I never expected to be as successful as it was, because my brother said to me, do you think this will sell? And I gave him a whole spiel about the fact that there are however many books published per year. Very, very few ever get to the bestseller list. A tiny number get to, the top 1, 2, or 3. However, Harry, I said, the publishers will give us a properly bound edition for our own shelves, and we'll always be able to look at that. And that genuinely is what we were thinking. It would be literally a few copies for our friends and family, and that was it. And then it turned out to outsell all of my other books, which was just phenomenal and surprising. And it was months at #1. It went to #1 in America. I did the Stephen Colbert show in New York. All sorts of strange things.
Wow.
Strange experiences I've never had. I was wafted about in limousines. It was a glimpse at a different life. And it lasted for the best part of a couple. It won Book of the Year. I beat Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion. He came second. And I remember thinking, my book has the 10 Commandments in it. Strange. How strange and odd to be standing here with Dara O'Brien asking me how to pronounce my name, and me thinking, does that mean that I've won? Because why would he want to know otherwise? It was a happy time and a strange and unexpected strike of lightning. But my main love has always been to write those stories that come from history that people, I hope, will continue to love to read.
What was the last book that you read?
It was Babylonia by Costanza Casati. It was really good. It was sort of historical fiction. I recommend it.
Nice.
Yeah.
It's
not out yet, I should say. It's out in a couple of months.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, it's very good.
What about the last film you watched?
Blimey. The last. I know this is because I don't know if you have children or what stage they're at, but I'm at a stage of my life where, with my children in particular, books and films, I keep recommending things I loved from previous stages in my life and sort of say, kids, you cannot go through life without having watched or seen this or read this. So the last one was Legends of the Fall.
Oh, excellent!
The wonderful Anthony Hopkins at his absolute best, Brad Pitt looking,
still hold up.
Oh, it does. Oh, it was fantastic. And watching my children, there was the bit. I'm trying to think of the name of the brother. Was it Quinn? Where the older brother turns out to be a hero in the end, and my heart still leapt. I've got to tell you, my goodness.
That's a good one, because I'm doing a similar thing with my kids. So that's one that I'd forgotten about off my list. So I'm definitely adding that one back to the list. Yeah.
It's back in the day when films seemed to be epic. Then.
Yes.
I haven't seen epic films like that without someone called Thanos in it for a very long time. And I don't know quite what's maybe... Oh, I saw Dune recently as well. I went to see Dune 2, which was very enjoyable, but it wasn't as good as Legends of the Fall.
And what about TV shows? What are you watching there?
Oh, well, I tend to... I've got a thing where I watch anything which is basically Sherlock Holmes based. So I watched House. I mean, I loved House, and I watched all those episodes, but I've also seen all of Monk, Bull. What's some of the examples? Lie to Me. That was a recent one, which was absolutely fantastic with Tim Roth. I loved that. Oh God, anything that is basically somebody solving puzzles. It's
Yeah.
such a cliche, but I like it. I do like murder mysteries, and of course the big benefit of crime fiction and the thing that I've never got into, but the comfort of it is that the baddies tend to be caught and the goodies tend to be the ones catching them, and everything's wrapped up nicely in the end, and you can go home happy. And it is a comforting genre, even if it's like Lee Child writing with extreme violence. It's still the goodie wins,
Yeah.
and the baddie is, well, in his case, shot to pieces usually or smashed up. So it's a very comforting genre. So that's the kind of thing I would watch.
Yeah. What about
Light.
have you watched Shogun? You
No,
mentioned
I
James
haven't
Clavell
yet, and the
earlier.
reason for that is because the James Clavell book I absolutely loved. I mean, I've got special editions of it and all sorts of things. It was one of the first, along with Taipan, was one of the first great books that I remember loving. It's one of those that makes you think this is something I want to do with my life. So I can't yet watch it. A Game of Thrones was a similar thing because I read G.R.R. Martin and loved his books. And I remember the initial shock of what happened to some characters. I mean, I can
Yeah.
even tell you where I was when these things happened. And then I wasn't necessarily, there was no shock, therefore, in the TV series. So I never got into that. So, at the end of the day, I do think books are, they're good value, kids. And I also think, they are more immediate and visceral and personal than the passive experience of watching television. And I do watch television, of course I do, films and TV, but books, you're in them, you're actually involved in them. And that's the
Yeah.
big difference. You're not just watching someone else's, Ridley Scott's creation, you're watching your own. And that's magical.
Nice. And the very, very last thing we always do is a super quick fire, either or. And I always say there's no right answer here, perhaps
Okay.
apart from one. But we'll start off with Nero or Caesar.
Nero.
Nice.
TV or cinema?
Cinema.
Night owl or early bird?
Night owl.
Music or no music when you're writing?
No music when I write. Love music, but I can't do two things at once. At all.
And the last one, I suspect I know the answer to this one is paper book or ebook.
Oh, it's paper book.
Yeah.
Well, you'll know authors always have a secret love of ebooks because of the 25% royalty. And that matters. That matters a great deal. But paper books are the things that I hold and take to bed with me and read. So, yes.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Excellent.
Oh, that was a lot of fun. Really enjoyed that chat with Conn
Yeah.
there. And I have to say, I feel like I really felt the stress when he was telling us about his application process, whereby
Yeah.
he essentially just wrote the start.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I can see the logic in it, I guess, that, but it's a risky thing to do to have not actually finished the book when you're sending it out.
And worse, to not keep track of which start you've sent
Yeah,
to which
yeah,
agent
exactly.
and which book you then have to finish writing in about 3 weeks.
Exactly. But it obviously worked out well for him. So I am someone that writes historical fiction, so I always find it really interesting to see the methods that other people bring to it in terms of research and what they view as important when they're telling these types of stories. Thanks very much to Conn for coming on the podcast. Nero is out now, and the sequels will be out next year. But next week we have another great guest.
Yes, indeed. We're chatting with the wonderful Dan Malakin next week, who his third book, The Wreckage of Us, is just out. A couple of weeks ago, I think, at time of recording. And it's a really fun chat we have with him. He's someone who, like many authors, wrote a lot before he got his first book out. Over 400 short stories he wrote.
Some of that was flash
9-year
fiction,
period.
as he told us.
Yes,
but, I mean,
that's
it's
true.
still
Yes,
an
but-
incredible...
And someone who, jumped around genres in that time, sci-fi, literary, comedy, really kind of finding his feet and learning his craft a little bit. So yeah, a really good chat about how he worked his way into full-length novels and where he took it from there.
Yeah, definitely. So it was a really fun chat again with Dan, and he's got some really good insights as well. We mentioned this to him actually. He's got a very good website with lots of resources for people that are wanting to write. He's clearly someone that has, as I suppose as we all do, but he's very clear that he's learned through the writing. He joined a writing group and all of that sort of stuff, and that's all helped him to develop and helped him to have the success that he's now got. So yeah, it's a really good podcast. So please do tune in for that one. But if you enjoyed today's podcast, please do take the time to rate and review us on your favorite podcast app. Reviews, I will say, expanding on what I usually say here, really help the podcasts get noticed and stuff. So if you are able to leave a nice review, please, then that would really help the podcast to reach more people, and that in turn helps us to continue to get great guests on the podcast.
Yeah. Bad reviews actually don't help us, so we don't need any of them, thanks. That's fine. If you want to get in touch with us, just to send us a question or comment, you can always do so by, a variety of methods. First of all, an email in the email machine, which is podcast@rightgear.co.uk, or you can find us on Twitter or pretty much any social media by searching for @UKPage1. We're on YouTube as well. Just search for Page One Podcast on YouTube. As Marcus said last week, all of our episodes are going up on YouTube, not just the video ones, but if you want to listen to the stuff on YouTube, I don't really get it, but there's some weirdos out there who like to listen to podcasts, and that's fine.
I've been I think we've got our first 100 episodes up there, and then everything from like 130 onwards, but those 30 missing episodes will go up at some point when I have the time to convert.
I mean, the people that the people are crying out. It's like the lost the missing episodes.
Yeah, exactly.
It'll be a big thing when they drop. It'll be big.
But yeah, otherwise, have a great week, and we will speak to you next time.
See you later.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please leave a comment down below, hit that thumbs up button, and be sure to hit that subscribe button as well, so you never miss an episode like these ones below.
And if you want to get in touch, you can always drop us a tweet in the Twitter machine, which is @UKPage1, as evidenced here, and our other social media channels are available.
Otherwise, we hope to see you next episode.
See you later.